Hello and welcome to MIP TV, and with me as always is Bob Cook from the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy. And in today's book review we've got a favourite. It's a favourite because it's someone we both know, and it's Dr. Jonathan Lloyd, who's known to both of us, and it's called Whales in the Desert. Not the place Wales, but the mammal that floats in the water, whales in the desert.
Right,
And
yeah.
maybe we start there, Bob. Why is it called Whales in the Desert?
Well, the book is all about metaphors in psychotherapy. And Jonathan picked this title because it was a metaphor one of his clients used. So he thought it was very apt. He wrote his doctorship on it and then turned it into a book. And he really liked this metaphor and the use of it in terms of the change the client made. So that's why he's called it that. But the book really is about the use of metaphor in psychotherapy. And it's a fascinating book because I think all therapists and counsellors use metaphor, even if they say they don't.
They do. They do. I think a lot of people don't realise just how common it is in the language. You know, it's as cheap as chips, Bob.
Very good, cheaper chips. There we are. And what he did, he went around many practitioners, including myself, and talked about the use of metaphor and did I like it and how I found it useful and the disadvantages as well as the advantages. So this book is a nice little book. It goes through different types of metaphors, different classifications of metaphors, talks about advantages and disadvantages of metaphors, and he looks at counselling, Rogers' model, client-centered counselling, CBT, and talks a lot about how Rogers actually used metaphors. And interestingly enough, and I didn't realise this, I was talking to Jonathan about an hour ago, actually. But interesting enough, Gloria, the Gloria wonderfully experimental tapes.
Gloria Zaimansky, yes.
Yeah. Well, when Rogers was talking to Gloria, he used quite a lot of metaphors in the sense of being able to attune to the client's frame of reference. So
he did. Yes, and metaphors are kind of verbal shortcuts, and we all use them. I used the phrase cheap as chips, and that would indicate that something is very common. It's very common. It's there's no scarcity to it, and I would agree with Jonathan that we use metaphors and simile a lot more than perhaps we realise in counselling. A lot more.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And they're a way of being able to, if you like, help the person use their creative part of their brain and visualize, if you like, not only their journey ahead, but the sabotage mechanisms which is stopping them, and also be able to create a whole movement metaphor, if you like, where there's a metaphor, a story of movement and hope towards the end goal. I really like them. I use them a lot, and I use them a lot specifically when I'm going towards a vulnerable area, if you like. So it's a way of actually helping the person tell a story in a very process-oriented way.
Yes, and it's also with metaphors. They can use a metaphor on their own terms. They don't have to go deep into the material or re-traumatise. The metaphor can speak, to use another metaphor, speak volumes about what's right for them.
That's right. I mean, it's very difficult if we think about it to talk, have a conversation, perhaps even without using a metaphor.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's Professor Andrew. Let me just have a look. Who was the forward in this book? Oh yeah, Michael Jacobs, who we've probably all heard of. Wrote a lot of counselling and psychotherapy books. He does a forward in this book, and he talks about how he uses metaphors and some of the disadvantages of metaphors in his opinion. But for him, he also uses metaphors in a way of entering into, again, vulnerable areas and giving the person a transitional space, if you like, as Winnicott called it, to be able to explore these areas in a sort of safe way.
Yeah, yeah, it is fascinating, and of course, I think what we forget is metaphors are not something that's part of the English language. They appear in lots of different languages. You know, and I guess you can go as far back as the Greeks, where people talked about things that happened around campfires and made a metaphor for it as they kind of made their gods. You know, so
Right.
very, very, very useful. Why do you think this is useful specifically for students, Bob?
Well, it gives a classification of metaphors, different types of metaphors. Metaphors around the idea of hope, for example, which I really like. You know, holding the hope for the client. He talks about what is called movement metaphors. He talks about what is called illusionist metaphors. So there's some nice chapters on classifications of metaphors. He also talks about, which is really interesting, the idea of really what he talks about is psychodynamic therapists often tend to initiate or bring in their own metaphor into the therapeutic dialogue, where client-centered counselors will, of course, tend to allow the client to bring their own metaphor in. And he talks about the advantages and disadvantages of that, which is really interesting. If you think of a beginning counselors who may, if they're following a client-centered model particularly, might wait for the metaphor to come out of the lips of the client. Whereas a psychodynamic therapist who looks at the past informing the present, and perhaps TA therapists are more direct, they actually initiate or bring in a metaphor to help a person move from, say, child ego state to adult ego state. So there's an interesting difference.
Yes, yes, and it is something that is our currency as therapists, that rich use of language and how it's spoken and how it's understood. It sounds like an interesting book. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Jonathan Lloyd a couple of years ago, and I found his work really, really interesting.
Another part of a chapter is the disadvantages of using metaphors.
Oh, right, okay.
And I think I just quickly want to mention one of the caveats he talks about, and that is, by definition, often when you use metaphors in counseling and psychotherapy, you often invite a regressed place. In other words, a person going backwards or to different parts of their creative systems to make it a younger place. And his caveat is, make sure they're in the here and now when they leave the therapy room.
Oh, yes. Yes, because metaphors can be like a time machine, can't they? They can take us back in time. Yeah,
a lot back in. And I think that's a very important caveat, especially for the beginning counselor who might, watching this video, think, right, I might use a metaphor to enable myself to be more attuned to the client, or enable myself to go into vulnerable areas in a distanced way. And, you know, we must think about, it's important not to leave them in a younger regressed state, but actually get themselves grounded before they leave the therapy room. And he talks quite a bit about that, and I think it's a really important point. Also in the book, he talks about various metaphors of his clients. Like, I think one of the metaphors right at the beginning is the client that comes in who's very anxious, for example, and talks about the three monkeys in his head: see no evil, do no evil, hear no evil, and how they persecute him, and he uses that metaphor to help the person quieten their anxiety. So I think metaphors are a wonderful way to enable the client themselves, if you like, to move through sabotaged places, or to explain by narrative and metaphor what's actually happening inside their internal framework. And if you use a movement metaphor, how to actually move on to a place of nirvana rather than stuckness.
Yes. When you say a movement metaphor, what would you mean by that, Bob?
Well, say, for example, how can I explain? You might use a waterfall, which is, or a river, which starts off in quite a stuck place, a sort of turbulent river. And as you explore the metaphor, it goes towards a calm haven.
Mm.
And as it goes along from the turbulence part of the river to the calm haven, maybe you would come across a whale, or maybe you would come across a, an actual riverbank, but you're moving towards a calmer place in your psyche.
Yeah.
And the metaphor has a movement of its own.
This is very much about attunement as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it exactly. Attuning and helping the person with their frame of reference. And I'm a real fan of metaphors, so I really would recommend this book for all the counselors and therapists who want to use, if you want to call it technique in a relational way, to help the person explain through metaphors, which we've just talked about how easy it is in this language, their internal narrative.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's fascinating. The book's called Whales in the Desert by Dr. Jonathan Lloyd. We're going to put a link in below, so if you're interested in this book, Bob doesn't get paid for book reviews; he does them just for the love of them. If you pop the link below in the comments bar below. Have you read the book? What's your view on metaphors? Let's have some comments. I'm always interested in what people have to say. And if you want to buy the book or look at the book, there's no time like the present to use a metaphor.
Absolutely, that's very good, Rory. I like that.
All right, well, check the book out, and that's all really from us.